Rec resources. The main kind of story here is this is going to be very much a closely tied child resource, and it makes sense, to the so-called parent material, bedrock. Right, so where you have a volcanic, Lassen Crater, Hawaii volcanoes, Haleakala National Park. Maybe your national park has Mount St. Helens, for example. A lot of our national parks have volcanic features, and therefore underlying volcanic geology, and that means very specific and stark consequences for all of the landscape resources that are built on top of or out of, in the case of soil resources like today, built out of those volcanic bedrock or that parent material. So throughout our discussion today, as we're talking about soils as resources first, our dynamics of how we use those in recreation and how those dynamics tend to create specific patterns and cycles of impacts like trail erosion at Panther Den and so forth. And then finally, what do we do about that? How do we manage these things? Soils is going to be a real big one because soils are a direct, unmitigated reflection of the bedrock resource. We can't get away from, again, volcanic soils or karst type soils around cave systems, sandy type soils along all the national coastlines and seashores, national seashores and stuff like that. So this is going to be kind of a linchpin resource class for everything else that follows, right? If the soil isn't healthy, if we're not managing the soils, fundamentally everything else is going to be profoundly impacted, right? Like all of the adverbs. It's a very serious and dependent relationship to this class of resources today. So let's get into it a little bit. So we don't typically think of dirt, which we'll define very specifically here in a second, as sort of an exceptional or exciting kind of resource, but in the case of national parks, it absolutely is. And so there are places in the Andes Mountains of South America, there are places all along the Hawaiian volcanic chain that look exactly like this, and we're just staring at soil. So, for the purposes of our discussions, our management exercises in this class, which is not the same context as soil science or agronomy or anything like that, we're going to call soil as the natural matrix of soil particles and water and soil gases and the soil biota, all of the living things moving around in that matrix of soil. All of that together is going to be soil. And dirt, we're going to classify as everything that is soil that is out of place, where it was not originally generated or deposited by natural processes. Okay? So, soil erosion moves dirt. Impactful kinds of forest and outdoor recreation, like mudding, for example, right? The activity has the specific dependency of resource right in the name, encoded in there as mud, right? So, we want to define those very carefully. Is everybody clear on that? So, soil is all of the loose stuff that's not bedrock, all of the stuff that's flowing or saturated into it, like water and gases, also all the living stuff moving around. So, we're going to kind of shorthand a whole bunch of species into a soil resource, all right? But since a lot of these creatures are biologically tied to the soil, they can't live away from it, it kind of makes sense to throw in lots of our entomological resources, a lot of our insects and microorganisms into this class of resource because we can't meaningfully separate them for long. So there is that, all right? So this is Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. This is a combination of bedrock, specific rock type here, being relatively quickly erodible or erosive. It is a combination of that plus this alluvium. That's a key term that we've seen before. This is the soil, right? The loose stuff that has been liberated from that rock, everything that is a coarse fragment the size of a house or a boulder or a car, on down to anything that's about 2 millimeters in diameter. It's going to be called a coarse fragment of soil. And then down from there we have sand, silt, and clay particles, most finely divided, smaller than that. Okay? We also have a topographic resource here. Right? It's not just the fact of the presence of this rock, the presence of this soil, it is also the shape or the conformation of those things. If you're a hydrologist, you would use the term morphology, the study of the shape of things. Okay, cool. This is also a water resource. This is also the experiential resource, the opportunity to experience this unique combination of things in this place. All right, so there is no substituting for this. Now, if you've ever been to Little Grand Canyon here in Southern Illinois, or you've been to the Grand Canyon, or maybe in the future after we've melted all of our glaciers and stuff like that, and we get to explore by submarine the massive canyon they just found under the Greenland ice sheets. Someday we'll be able to turn that into a national park or whatever. We can see that soil, there's no getting away from it, right? So this is, again, really absolutely a linchpin class of resource, okay? So we're gonna get a little bit more technical with this class of resource than we have with our, for example, our topological resource class. Topological is a very high concept, right? What's the map of nodes and lines that connect those nodes together? Those lines representing things like roads or trails or migration corridors. What's the connectedness of your other resources? That's topological resource. So kind of a high concept thing, at least at the level in which we're studying it in this class. But because all of our other kinds of resources depend directly and clearly and inescapably on the soil resource, let's get into a little bit more detail with this one so we can kind of get a little bit more close in on our management coming up here. All right, so we've got 4 components of soil, and we've got the structural components, which are the matter or the solid matter. Okay, and then we've got the void space, which is, loosely speaking, if you're rounding to whole numbers, the other 50% of the space, right? So the water, again, and the atmospheric gases that are not just present in the soil, but are flowing through the soil, that are pooling in the soil. For example, your parents, if you grew up in a house with a crawl space or a basement, your parents may have had to install radon detectors. Radon is a naturally occurring, slightly radioactive gas present in low concentrations throughout a lot of places in the United States and across the world. And so when you dig a basement, you are modifying the soil of that localized area, and because gases can migrate through the soil pore spaces, the voids in between those sand, silt, clay, and coarse fragment particles, there's airspace and there's water space in there, and gases flow through that and migrate sideways. Radon, as a heavy gas, can migrate into your basement and then sort of pool up in your basement, and eventually over time, if you're breathing that, that's a cancer risk. Okay, so we've got our structural components. That's going to be the inorganics, the stone material, and it's also going to be, the inorganics are also going to include the sand, silt, and clay as well. Organics are going to be things like, how many of you guys have taken soils or forest soils? Okay, right, so you guys know about soil strata? Yes? All right, do you guys know about the O horizon? Do you know about the O1 versus the O2 horizon? Ah, sweet. We can move pretty fast with this. All right, so organics are going to be things like your O1 and O2 horizon, but then, again, it's also going to be material that, thanks to soil boring or soil burrowing organisms that are transported through and down and away from the surface through those other strata, so you can have leaf debris down in the A, the B horizon. We don't typically see stuff much below that in terms of organics. But because this stuff is getting sort of slowly washed through the soil column over time, we want to think of this as just this sort of this dump cake mixture that sort of forms from the bottom up and is forming from the top down, and things are intermixing through these different layers as they go, right? As you know from your soils class. Okay, so we've got sort of coarse litter. So that's going to be stuff like surface fragments of, in this case, we're going to use litter to refer to organic materials, so things like leaf litter, so O1 horizon, non-consolidated, non-degraded, non-pulverized organic material. We are going to call that litter for this class. Coarse fragments, again, are going to be things like that alluvium we saw in this photo here, right? So this is not all sand, silt, and clay. Anything bigger than 2 millimeters in diameter, we're going to call fragments, or specifically coarse fragments. Okay? And then humus is the organic soup of stuff that has been pulverized down and is no longer typically identifiable chunks of, well, this is a leaf, or this is a dead beetle's leg, or something like that, right? So for those of you who went on our field trip to Ozark Scenic Riverways a couple weekends ago, we had a couple of spots where we saw this foam, kind of this tan foam floating on the water. That is a foam made up of humic organic acids. Okay, so this is the waterborne component of what is already somewhat mixed into the soil as well. And then in those void spaces, those pores, right? So soil is not a solid thing. It is a matrix of lots of little stuff and spaces in between the stuff. And so we've got the wet section, the soil solution, which we're going to pay most of our attention to the soil pH, which is the log concentration of hydronium ions in water, so H plus ions, free protons in the water. And we're going to pay attention to natural, and in our case, we want to pay a lot of attention to any anthropogenic dissolved chemicals. Anything we're putting into our soil column on top of a cave is going to end up in that cave sooner or later, right? It's just gravity, it's just subsurface flow at that point. It's out of our control typically. So we need to be very careful about that. And then for the dry pores, we have gases. And those are migrating much, much faster typically than the water is, because it's a much less viscous fluid, but gases, at least in gravity, behave like fluids just like liquids do. Okay? We'll see more evidence of that in our sky section of the resources, but we do want to understand that there is a lot of soil breathing happening all the time in most kinds of soil that are biologically active. And it is a really pretty different world than what we are used to. Okay? So, one characteristic of the combination of those attributes from the previous slide that is very useful for us in forest recreation management, in managing our facilities, managing and protecting our living resources, is going to be the basic characteristic of soil texture, right? So if you think back to your soils class, how does that soil feel when you grab a sample and try to mix it in your hand? Is it gritty? Is it powdery? Is it very coarse? Is it something like decomposed granite, where the grains of decomposed granite sand are not sand size, but could be the size of a pea or a marble? Okay? So, soil texture and the balance, the fraction occupied by each of these different size classes, obviously, as you know from soils, drives lots and lots of properties of that soil. Its biological activity, its nutrient availability, its ability to infiltrate water versus push water and keep it on the surface as overland flow, for example. So where we have flooding concerns as a safety risk for our visitors, that's driven by soil texture in a very large way. So for example, in the American Southwest, for any of you who have selected a park in Red Rocks country or on the Colorado Plateau out west in Arizona, Utah, southwestern Colorado, places like that, a lot of people at certain moments of the year get caught by surprise and occasionally killed by flash floods in the desert because very dry desert soils with finer textures, including clay particles, don't infiltrate soils don't infiltrate water from occasional storms very much at all. So those dry creek beds that are so great for hiking and that are so amazing as wildlife migration corridors when they're dry become kind of a death trap. We'd think the desert is sand and rain infiltrates through sand instantly. But that's just not actually the case out in the wild in a lot of kinds of desert with any soil texture other than pure sand. Okay, so if it's like a clayey loam desert soil, well then we're gonna have flash flooding problems a lot. And we might have a 10 or 15 or 20 foot high pile of debris and rubble, dead branches, entire trees that have been grabbed by the floodwaters and are being shoved as kind of a battering ram at the front of the flood. And the water head pressure is building up behind it and it's just shoving it downstream continuously and very occasionally catching somebody by surprise and just tumble cycling them until there's not much of that person left. Okay, so we want to pay attention in forest recreation management to the proportions. What we are looking for in terms of an ideal soil type for forest and outdoor recreation that is most useful for us is going to be an even about 32% each of sand, silt, and clay, with a little bit of coarse fragment and just a little bit of organic material. So that organic material is going to help us hold just a little bit of water in the soil. It's also going to decay by bacterial, microbial, fungal, detritivore action and leave behind soil voids where that is to keep the soil bulk density a little bit lighter so it's not a hard packed, very dense, not a lot of water or gas or soil organism migration possible. Okay? So the ideal for a trail, let me repeat this, the ideal for a maintainable, manageable, sustainable trail is ideally about 32% sand, 32% silt, 32% clay particles. And importantly, we're going to cut that trail surface, we're going to incise it right past the O-horizon completely. We're going to take the O-horizon where the trail is going to be and remove it and fling it down the slope. Just get rid of it. Okay? Or we're going to save it and build up sections of trail if we need to bench or whatever. We'll talk about those specifics later. But we need a little bit of organic material to hold those particles together. We need that 1/3 fraction, 1/3-ish fraction of clay particles, which are highly electrostatically active, meaning they're sticky when wet. Right? We all know that clay soil is very sticky when wet. Kaolin clay, which is born of volcanic parent material from millions of years ago, right? Very, very fine particles, and the surface area and molecular sort of electric activity on the surface of a clay particle just comes alive in the presence of water as a medium, right? So we have positively charged surfaces, negatively charged surfaces, charged particles, and they glom onto each other. Right? A lot of soil fertility is based on this particular characteristic of clay particles. Okay, so where we have a very sandy soil, like it's 95% sand and just a little bit of everything else, that trail is going to be a disaster on any kind of a slope because there's nothing to hold those big old coarse sand particles together. It's going to drain water very easily, but it's also going to drain the soil particles away very easily too if there's any kind of slope present, right? So think about how flat most of the beaches you've seen are. And think about how much wave energy, how much hurricane energy, how much storm energy it takes to constantly rebuild or eat away at a beach with even just a very slight slope. If we have a purely clay soil, well then we're going to have too much of that shrink swell, that electrostatic interaction between water and ions in the water and the surface of the soil particles themselves. And indeed, a pure clay soil, nothing can really grow in it long term because if you get a root hair sideways through a clay soil and then it dries out and it shrinks apart, and there might be a 2 or 3 inch gap between chunks of soil called head-ons or beds, right? You're taking all of those roots and pulling them apart with thousands of pounds of pressure. Saturated mud has a suction pressure potential of up to 40 or 50,000 pounds per square inch. Okay, so imagine you're a tree and you're trying to grow your toes sideways throughout this soil, and you hit a lens of clay soil, and you get the roots out in there because they happen to encounter that soil when it is soft and pliant, when it is well hydrated, and then you hit a dry season and just amputate all of those toes overnight. Right. So the same thing is true on trails. So we need that mix. We need that sort of Goldilocks zone of a little bit of column A. We need the drainage and gas and water transport characteristics of sand. We need the electrostatic sort of glom-on or stickiness effect of clay particles, and silt to kind of fill in the rest of that bulk density. Okay? Cool. All right. Am I mostly just repeating things that you've heard so far in soils class so far? Good. All right. That means we can sort of run forward and get after more applications than just talking about these definitions. Okay? So, soil structure is the product of particle accretions into macroparticles, right? When you pick up a clod of soil, we would call that a macroparticle. It is an accretion of some sand, some silt, some clay, some organic material, maybe some bugs, maybe some roots, maybe some dead detritus, organic material, some humus, and so forth. And from that structure, we get a constantly evolving environment of pore spaces. Okay? Now, we need to start applying these concepts specifically to recreation, especially if we are relatively familiar with them from previous classes, right? So, soil consistence. What's the consistency of this soil? We're gonna sort of shorthand this as the strength of the soil. And this matters in forest and outdoor recreation because we are applying force to soils over and over and over, typically in the same spaces, along a trail, along a road, along a climbing pitch, if you are into that sort of a thing, along the path that you are using to drag or wheel or skid out the elk that you just quartered up in the field, and so forth. So, these soil characteristics mean something for your visitors. Right? We would call this bedrock that is so weathered, it's very chossy in the parlance of climbers, excuse me, meaning it is prone to easy breakage, and this person may not even be climbing on rock. They may be climbing on soil that just kind of looks like rock to the uninitiated because it's already physically and chemically separated from that parent material. So we can see how certain kinds of soil types lead to not just resource impacts, but potentially direct safety risks for our visitors, right? So if we want to run horseback riders through some section of our national park, we have to accept the reality that the constraints that the soil type, the soil consistence is just going to impose. Now we can do soil amendments. So when you have a rutted double track, so like a Jeep trail or something like that, like an old farm road maybe that was incorporated into your national park. In the space of that old dusty, muddy double track when it rains, we can amend that soil and artificially change the soil texture to bring the soil consistence to a place where it's a little bit more useful or sustainable or beneficial. So has anybody ever driven down a gravel road before? Yeah, we all have, right? That's exactly what I'm talking about. This is purely an effort to get after building in soil particles of a mixed size set. Everything from coarse fragments, right? The gravel on the trail, or the road, excuse me. to the finer bits of, typically it's crushed limestone that we're amending with, that are very, very small particles, okay? And what we're doing is bringing it closer to that even mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And in that way, we haven't permanently fixed the issue of durability on that road or trail by adding mixed fines gravel, and all of the soil particle size is smaller than that. But we have kicked the can way down the road. So if a double track could handle, I don't know, 100 horses a day before amendment, because it's just a soil trail, and then we bring out lots and lots of dump truck loads of amended soil and so forth, then we get after use levels up in the 10,000 horses a day range, as long as it's not raining, because even that amended soil, when it's saturated with water, the soil consistency changes dramatically, right? So we all know what it's like to slog through mud. Well, we just can't ignore the basic processes of physics to get after it, okay? So we're going to define that soil consistency as resistance to penetration. And a horse's hoof is shaped like a hypodermic needle or a syringe tip. All right, so think of a hollow tube that's cut at an angle. That is the cross-section of a horse's hoof. And so a horse, which is walking digitigrade or on its toes, right? So it's fused toes. When it steps on the ground, it's going to push off. Now, you know how much a typical horse weighs? Like just a trail riding horse, quarter horse, something like that. 700 pounds, 100 pounds, something like that. Right? The science of kinesiology, of the mechanics of biological movement, tells us that when you have let's say a 700-pound horse walking on the ground, it's pressing against the ground to push forward and move forward. But it's not pressing with 700 pounds of pressure. It's pushing up to 4 times that much, right? So you can get over a ton of pressure through a horse's hoof, especially if it's galloping, right? And it's propelling its entire body with one hoof touching the ground at a given time, instead of 2, 3, or 4 hooves in contact with the ground, spreading that ground pressure out. Okay? So, all that to say, a wet, saturated soil is prone to not having much resistance to penetration. So at Jubilee College State Park, up north of us, I don't know if anybody's from around that area, did a fun research and service project with the horseback riding aficionados there at the state park, and they were diehard, still are, assume they're still around, diehard horseback riders, and we got to work with them to figure out how could they volunteer to maintain and update and upgrade this trail network so that they could ride more, because they just really liked to ride. And a big part of the answer was, all right, we need to get a bunch of soil amendments out here, because the soil type across most of central Illinois, anybody know what the soil series are up north? Like the corn and soy desert. Watch your dog run away for 3 days because it's flat. It's glacially scraped and then brought over by wind from Missouri following the last ice age, or during the last couple of interglacial periods. So it's called Peoria Loess, or Alford Silt Loam, and they are wonderfully biologically active soils for growing corn and soy. We are a powerhouse. We help feed literally the entire world out of the farms of Illinois. However, as the youth say, one drawback of having that very fine, almost powdery Peoria Loess soil, because it was so lightweight, the soil particles could be brought over on the wind by windstorms from Missouri way back in the day, it's just kind of a mushy mess the moment you apply any ground pressure to it. So those tractor tires need to be very low pressure, and they need to be huge so that the contact patch is enormous and there's relatively very few pounds of pressure per square inch, so that we're not pressing down those very finely divided soils. When you run horses through the Shawnees, trails, unamended, through anywhere in central Illinois, immediately with the first pass, we are breaking down that soil structure and repowdering, pulverizing, for the Latin term, to dust. Pulverizing that soil back into that Peoria Lust, easily wind-blown particle form, and then blowing it eastward into Indiana and Ohio. Okay, so soil consistency, we're going to live and die in our recreation management efforts by soil consistency. Right? We can't change the physics of how a horse moves across the ground. What we do have good control over is, can we amend the soil where the horses are specifically going to be, like with some mixed fine scrabble? Can we schedule times that the horses can be out there and when they can't be out there? So part of the answer for Jubilee College State Park Trail Network was, you just can't ride for the first 24 hours after rain. There's no way that we can make this work for you. And if you love this place, and they sure do, then, check the weather report and plan out your next couple of days of riding based on that. And if you just hold back a little bit after the rain, then the rest of the year, this place is going to be amazing for you. And you can have tons of riding with minimal environmental impact, trail impact, and stuff like that. And it all just comes down to soil consistency. Sound good? All right. Soil compressibility is how spongiform, how compressible is the structure, the matrix of the soil. Okay? So, how much can we deform with the application of pressure when we are doing something? If you take a handful of sand, wet or dry, and squeeze it, nothing happens. When you take a handful of clay soil, it is highly plastic or reshapeable or deformable. That's all that plastic means. Okay? So, when we have any kind of high impact recreation activity, we're looking to match the soil type to the kind of activity. So for sand railing and dune buggying and off-road motorcycling on sand dunes and stuff like that, we can drive cars over sand dunes forever. And then the next windstorm picks up and all those tracks are completely gone, right? Where they are pure sand dunes, where they're not capped by vegetation, where sand dunes are absolutely categorically excluded from, where vehicular recreation and even hiking is absolutely verboten or forbidden, is where we have sand dunes that are created by typically water wave action, like at a seashore or a beach. And there's not enough sand paramaterial, there's not enough constant strong wind to shape and maintain and migrate enormous big dunes that we could drive stuff over. So what happens with those smaller, much more fragile dunes is they get covered in shore vegetation, very shallow rooting grasses, for example, seagrasses. And then the first person walks over that to try and find a quiet spot with their special somebody behind the dunes, get a little bit of privacy for them and their special somebody, and where those two people walked, they kill off the grass in that one particular set or pair of footprints, and then the entire dune system erodes back from that incision in both directions until the entire dune is gone. So when you see really angry looking signs at a national seashore, or where you see even straight up fencing we saw at Acadia National Park at the one sand beach, which has a rank of about 8-foot high dunes in back of Sand Beach. People are physically excluded from going up there, and it's ugly. Like, there's just like a fence and signs that say you can't go past this point. This is extremely fragile. There's no way we can make this safe for you, sustainable for the wildlife, even to the point of a single person walking across this. We don't even go here, right? That's just the reality of working with soil compressibility and pairing it with certain kinds of recreation, right? So, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We don't see dunes and go, nope, categorically exclude everybody for all time, forever. If those dunes are held and maintained and grown by the presence of shallow rooting grassy vegetation, yes, we exclude stuff. If those dunes are naturally sculpted by powerful winds, and the winds have been doing that for 10,000 years, and the highway don't care if we're driving motorbikes across it, then yeah, we can pack a whole lot of motorized, extremely otherwise damaging recreation onto that sand, not have to think about it, not have to worry about it a bit. Okay? So, these basic characteristics of different soils are going to give us pretty clear signposts on what do I answer when Dr. Park says, all right, what are you doing with this area of your national park towards the end of the semester? Okay? So, we want to use a resource called Web Soil Survey. Write that down, Web Soil Survey. It is awesome. And we want to get a sense of, at least for a couple of areas in your park, you don't have to get the entire GIS map with detailed layers and attribute tables. You can dive pretty deep on Web Soil Survey. But we do want to know, generally speaking, at your national park, what kind of soil textures, what kind of soil compressibility, what kind of soil puncture resistance am I looking at here? Okay, cool. Cool. All right. Soil strength is exactly what it sounds like. It's the soil's ability to bear load. So this is an image of some people at Acadia National Park that are walking along bog bridging, where it's going through a swampy area. And the soil strength, its ability to bear load without compressing, without deforming plastically as mud, is very low. Saturated soils are very weak. They're tissue soft. Okay. Cool. And while all soils are relatively vulnerable to synthetically powerful knobby tires powered by bottled sunlight from millions and millions of years ago in the form of gasoline, saturated soils are absolutely extra in this way. And this is specifically paired with, think about where soils are going to be wetter longer. In low-lying areas, in depressions, in valleys, in stream beds. Okay? So, if you are on a motorbike with knobby tires, a dirt bike, or a UTV, an ATV, a side-by-side, an OHV, a gator, a Unimog, whatever, the primary issue is going to be one of just the raw power. We're talking about up to hundreds of horsepower delivered to the drive wheels of these things. And that's a lot of horsepower to concentrate on a contact patch smaller than a saucer plate. Okay? The other part of it that makes this so particularly injurious or ruinous is that our fossil fuel powered vehicle in the wettest area, where on this diagram, if we are at the top heading down, at the bottom heading up, where on this diagram do we need to apply most of that torque, that horsepower, that ability to rip and tear until it is done? Doom guy. Where on the diagram do we need to open the throttle wide? Is it at the top, rolling down? Or is it at the bottom, where it's wet, to try and climb out? Okay. Now, this is also true to a lesser extent with your feet, with horse hooves, and so forth. But the effect, the amount of sort of bottled energy that you have at your disposal with an internal combustion engine vehicle, and these days, I'm really concerned about electric vehicles which have maximum torque at 0 RPMs. So Cybertrucks are just a dumpster fire for off-roading. But that's not the end of electric off-roading vehicles. Rivians are fairly capable, and others will come, right? So when you have like 5, 6, 7, 800 horsepower maximally available when you're getting ready to climb that wall from the bottom in an electric off-road vehicle, man, you can dig to China or Australia pretty fast by spinning those tires and throwing up what is glamorized in some circles as a rooster tail. Oh man, look how cool, look how powerful this is, look how amazing we are, right? So, unfortunately, that is the human dynamic that our soil strength is going to run afoul of. Soil bulk density is just how much matter is in any given unit volume of the space, okay? Soil bulk density is going to be one of the primary characteristics that we actually measure out in the field as a proxy for all of these other things. Because creating a detailed soil map of every soil texture and every soil compressibility, and every soil strength, and so on and so forth, it's expensive, it's slow, it's hard work. How many of you guys had to dig a soil pit in your soils pass? I'm sorry, you're never gonna get that time back, right? Like, it's just hard work moving shit, right? But that's okay. What we can do out in the field for recreation management purposes is understand that soil bulk density isn't going to give us directly everything that we need to know about all those others, but it's going to get us like 95% of the way there. And for management purposes, good enough, right? You're a busy ranger, you're on the hoof all the time, working and working and working, and so you can take a quick soil density measurement with something like, or a proxy for soil bulk density like a soil penetrometry measure in your campsites, in the center line of your trails, to diagnose what is the physical quantitative health or sustainability of this trail. We just punch it with a penetrometer and see how easy it is or not to stab into the soil at the center of that campsite or that trail or the recreation site, like the base of a climb, for example, is a place where we've done this a lot across the Shawnee. And where we find unsustainable soil bulk densities, we're actually happy with that if it's in the trail. If it's in an established campsite that is functionally permanent within a near time frame, if it's in the base of an established climbing route or area, that's good. That area is going to be biologically dead if that soil bulk density is super high. If we can't stab something down into it because it's already packed as tight as it can, like all the pore space is crushed out and so forth, it's not gonna get and stay muddy because there's no pore space for that water to infiltrate through. It's just gonna run off, right? So we're gonna manage areas of high soil bulk density where we are amenable to it. Sorry, I don't want to use the word amenable in talking about soil amendments. We're going to use soil bulk density measurements where it is agreeable to concentrate use on the spots like established campsites, like established trails, like the base of climbing sites, like horse hitching posts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want that to be really pretty hard packed soil. That's going to be functionally better armored up than anything else in terms of a natural soil surface. Now, we're also going to be looking for that bulk density, but at the other end of the range. We want everything on both sides of that trail, everything around that campsite or that campground, to have a very low soil bulk density, to have lots of pore spaces, lots of frost heaving action and detritivores, worms, fungi, breaking down organic material, leaving open holes and burrows and trails through which gases and fluids can migrate through that soil matrix. All right? So we're stabbing stuff in the middle of campsites, and then we're also going 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters away from that campsite in a transect and measuring points along the way to make sure that our bulk density is very high, like off the chart high, as high as it can go, in the middle of the campsite. And then immediately falling off to a minimum soil bulk density or soil penetrometry reading. So that'll be one of our lab exercises coming up. Stay tuned for that one. Okay. Now, soil bulk density does increase with depth as you pack more overburden of soil and trees and rocks and roads and all that stuff on top of soils, right? There's just increasing pressure, and eventually there is too much pressure for the water to exist in those pore spaces. The water gets squeezed out, right? That's down in like basement bedrock territory. But even in the soil column, we do have a relationship, healthy relationship, a natural relationship with increasing soil bulk density with depth. What that means for our applications in recreation and park management is that when you are building a trail in a very steep environment, where you're cutting sideways into a sharp slope, like almost a cliff face even. Cliff faces are awesome for building trails, like halfway up the cliff. They're perfect for sustainability, right? What you're gonna do is dig into that cliff face as far as you can. Now, you might be moving tons of soil per meter of trail excavated to get into that mineral soil that is biologically dead. We don't have to worry about detritivores tearing up the trail and stuff like that. And we may have to take some of that overburden that we've removed from that spot and place it on the outer, the downslope edge of the trail to try and build up some additional width of the trail, instead of just broadcasting or flinging that dirt downslope and letting it reincorporate into the soil below, if that's sustainable for the watershed nearby. We're gonna use that soil. Unfortunately, we've just dug up a bunch of soil and broken it up and loosened it up, and it's the top strata, those O1, O2, the A horizon, the real biologically active stuff. It's light, it's low soil bulk density. And so if we're trying to build that on as a borrowed section of additional trail, well then, shoot. We're not gonna get real far with that, because we're gonna have to compact that soil that we've borrowed, that we've dug up, to try and get it closer to the soil bulk density of the stuff that is the mineral soil, the native soil in place that we've incised down to. Here's a diagram of what I'm talking about with that. So, let's say we are looking side on, so this is a profile or a cross section of a hill slope. And we don't want to put the trail at the top of the slope for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later here in soils. We definitely don't want to put the trail at the bottom of the slope because that's where all the water lives. We don't want wet trails and wet feet and broken ankles. So, can't go around it, can't go under it, gotta go through it. Let's cut out a section of this very steep slope and take this wedge or triangle of soil and remove it. And then we'll compact down this new trail surface. Again, we're down into like the B and C horizon mostly here. So mineral soil, it's not biologically active. It's already very high bulk density relative to the other lighter stuff. Still heavy, when we're shoveling, but lighter stuff up here. And we're just throwing that soil downslope and saying, live your best life. Or we are taking that volume of soil and benching, right? So this would be called a half bench trail, where half of the width of the trail is constructed and the other half width is the sort of raw or mechanically compacted mineral soil, okay? Can everybody see this with the glare from the windows? Okay. So a half bench trail is going to be a maintenance nightmare for the rest of your life. So a big chunk of the entire job of America's most highly decorated Trails and Wilderness Coordinator, up until a couple of years ago, Kelly Pearson on the Shawnee National Forest, was to find and maintain a century of trails that had built in, the Shawnee Bluff country, a lot of steep slopes and stuff like that, and maintain with cribbing, so driving pylons, posts, putting a bunch of railroad ties down here to try and hold this stuff in place. It's just trying to erode, right? The angle of repose here is naturally about 45 degrees, and if we're building a vertical wall, all this is trying to do, all these soil particles are trying to do is just move. Just get down to where it's relaxed down to that natural 45-degree angle of repose. Okay? So, ideally, we would call this maybe B or C rank if we were doing a tier listing of trail construction approaches and evaluating them like online gaming strats. We might call this meh, or B or C tier, or maybe mid. Okay? All right, so let's take another example here where we dig in just a little bit further. And this is now the full width of the trail. This is a full bench trail construction. And full bench trails that were carved by the Romans are still in use as roads today. Think about that for a sec. That's a big deal, right? So your choices as the recreation managers, the trails boss for your national park, determine whether your highly decorated rock star Trails and Wilderness Coordinator is spending huge amounts of time and effort and sweat equity to repair this over and over and over until the end of time, because all this dirt wants to do is move, versus buy once, cry once, and it's done. Maybe for 2,000 years. Yeah. That's a big deal. Now, this is a big deal because when you're carving into this, you are making a change done right that is literally supposed to require a minimum of maintenance and repair out to a geologic timescale. And we're being very careful in this not to alter the flow of water. And there's a bunch of more specific close-in design tricks, like outsloping the trail 2 to 5%, French draining, all the stuff. We'll complexify this diagram a lot here in the next couple of weeks. But at the fundamental core of it, this is much more thermodynamically stable on the order of tens to hundreds to even a few thousand years. Okay, cool. So this is a powerful thing. Now, we've talked about the angle of repose for a half bench trail. So half bench versus full bench. We've talked about the angle of repose for this benched out section, or this half of the trail, being a problem, like a constant maintenance headache. This is where a trail will have a blowout, right? Where the trail just sloughs off, where there's frost heaving, freeze thaw, and earthquake, right? This is what collapses every time. This doesn't have that problem, but it still has an angle of repose problem. Can anybody see where this full bench trail might possibly fail? Near the top. How so?
That stuff up there, yeah, right there, is going to want to fall in if there's no like shark.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so to dig a full bench trail, we have to excavate out a lot more space. So if, for this half bench trail, think of it this way: to go double the half bench width incision wise, we have to remove more than twice as much material versus the half bench trail, which is why so many places don't bite the bullet and say, we'll fix it in post. That's the next guy's problem. I'm only seasonal for 1 year, fuck it, right? So the problem here is the full bench trail, if we're really doing this in a way that we know is going to just last, be a masterwork, the kind of trail that they will write books about, we have to relax this upslope as well. And we're going to try and get it as close as we can to the natural angle of repose. So now, that's a really big triangle. That's a really big triangle, okay? So, to the extent possible, we're looking for anywhere where the shape of the landform, the topography, lets us get to a full bench trail with a minimum of relaxed upslope. Okay? Makes sense? Cool. This has real consequences. So, professional trail designers, and there's a whole sort of cottage industry for this. Leave No Trace International Organization, International Mountain Biking Association, Subaru, all put lots and lots and lots of money into training up traveling teams of trail design experts who have come actually to help us, put together the trails at Touch Nature for all those mountain bikers and stuff like that. That's all L&T Subaru design stuff. Very cool. And what they are doing, meter by meter, on the whole proposed trail network is doing this math, right? Getting very, very high resolution, as much resolution as possible, digital elevation models, for those of you who've taken your GIS classes. So we're looking at LiDAR tier stuff, like it's gotta be that close in. So ideally something like 1 to 2 inch positional accuracy instead of like, this pixel is 30 feet by 30 feet, right? 10 meter pixel, 33 feet. Anyway, so super expensive, but it's a fire and forget missile of recreational awesomeness, right? And it's gonna be good for generations, right? So a lot of the trails that are cut in by organizations like Army Corps of Engineers, the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s and 40s, right? Great Depression leading up to World War II. The Works Progress Administration around the same time. To the extent that they were doing this, they were putting in, and the United States Cavalry before that, it might have been the United States Cavalry putting in the first trails up to Mount Whitney, I believe, out west. They're doing this with dynamite, right? Like, this is a road construction tier thing because on a steeper slope, you may not have 1 meter or 2 meters of loose soil to go through. You might hit bedrock 6 inches in, right? A very high slope thing, those alluvial fans can be real thin, even if they are very wide. So, this is the practical effect, the outcome, what is being driven by the inputs of what we are talking about. Power of Christ compels you. The input of soil bulk density as a proxy for all of these other characteristics. Okay, so that was a lot to talk about with one bullet point. I apologize. How you guys doing? You okay? Need a break? It's okay to say yes. All right, let's take about a 3-minute break. We'll come back to it, and we'll keep on rocking. Intensity in 10 cities, live in Budokan. about it. I was out sick most of last week. I'm still sort of picking stuff back up now. Not great, but getting better. Figure out what's going on with the Amazon thing.
Yeah.
Where that stuff is.
I also had part of like real estate that I took.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you. What would be the positive counterpart to net? Because net was originally a Simpsons thing. I'm going with woohoo. All right. Here we go. Get an updated picture of that. Unrelatedly, are any of you guys getting like 20 robocalls a day with all this political stuff?
I get a lot of texts, but I didn't know I signed up for it.
Okay.
I don't think I signed up for it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of spam going on. Yeah. And it's not my place to say how you vote or even try to influence that. I'm just saying go vote. It seems very important this year. Rock on. Okay, let's get back after it. All right, so this is a photo of one of the campgrounds in Zion National Park, if I believe. Oh no, excuse me, Bright Angel Campground in Grand Canyon. My mistake, my apology. I will fire myself. All right, so what we're talking about, what we're looking at is another side-on image here, this time in gloriously rasterized pixels instead of chalk. So, here the slope on the left-hand side of the image, you can see there's a fairly steep elevation change of 3-4 feet down to the bottom of the stream bed in the space of about 15-20 feet of lateral travel, right? And then right back up the other side, you can see the talus-covered slope gradient back up to these hardened, surfaced, and coped campsites. So coping stones placed around the edges of these sites, both as cribbing to retain the soil amendments inside each of those sites and to perform that visual reminder role of, hey, this is a visual boundary of your campsite. Please don't step past this. And we're going to intentionally make it a bit of a step down onto a steep slope so that you don't have a place to easily and safely step down, because we don't want you to do that. We want you to stay on that hardened, amended soil surface. Okay? So that is engineering bulk density to be artificially high inside each one of these sites, and that's perfect, right? Each one of these sites is going to have tents on it, for example. And even where it doesn't have a tent or a picnic table sheltering it from the rain is going to hit that, not be able to penetrate or infiltrate down in, because the soil bulk density has been mechanically compacted up to absolute maximum. There's no pore space left in there, and that water's going to drain off into this creek. Cool, right? So this is a practical application of how you engineer sustainable recreation for, in the case of Grand Canyon at Bright Angel Campground. This is, I don't know, maybe, Bright Angel's not that big. It's down in the bottom of the canyon. Maybe, I don't know, 150 people a night during peak season. Okay. But because the pressure down there in terms of use is extremely high. Like there's not a lot of places where you can walk where it's flat enough and safe enough to walk in Grand Canyon. So where you can, everybody's going to do it. The pressure is just almost immediately unsustainably high. So take a look on the left-hand side of Bright Angel Creek here, or one of the side creeks to Bright Angel. Do you see how there's a little walking path that goes right next to the water? All right, so the way that soil bulk density evolves when you start walking on it is as a function of subsidence. So you're walking across those soil particles and you're compacting them together. You're squishing all that water out. You're squishing some of that air out, soil gas in the matrix, okay? And so if you start with a relatively flat section of soil and then you compact, you increase the bulk density of all the particles under specifically and only where you are stepping, well then those particles now occupy that pore space that was below them. So right where people are walking, it dips down a little bit, and you can see that right here. Okay? So there is a beautiful, beautiful parabolic equation that describes the characteristic shape or curve that the cross-section of the surface of the planet adopts when you start walking across it in that place over and over. In my doctoral dissertation, it was a lot of fun to find that. I took a bunch of data from thousands of measurements across parks and stuff. Those were the days. Science and mathematics. Oh. Anyway, sorry, I forgot what I was talking about. That process of amending the bulk density of the soil underfoot with our feet is called soil compaction. And specifically, that soil compaction, again, takes the form of subsidence. It's only moving downward. And what that has done here and everywhere that there is a trail next to a creek or a stream or a river, which is a totally understandable place to want to go walking, right? Like, that looks like a pretty nice walk to me, is we have a beautifully parabolically scooped out stream bed, and we have got a beautifully parabolically scooped out stream bed where people have walked a stream bed into existence. So every time it floods or it rains, that depression is enough because there is any rise at all between the center line of that subsided, compacted down trail surface before the water can get over that hump, that berm as it's called, into the creek to the right. So if a water droplet falls anywhere on the left half of this image, it's gonna hit the ground, and if it's flowing over land, it's going to get entrained or trapped where people have walked this new stream bed into place. And the way that you drain this is you cut a trench so that the water can drain sideways off the trail into the creek below. The problem is the creek isn't that far below, so we don't have a lot of elevation to artificially sort of work with here. So this trail is always going to be a maintenance nightmare. Again, it's at the bottom of the slope. All the water wants to be at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, right? There's a whole river down here just out of frame of this photo. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, guys. You should hike this if you ever get the chance and you can do it safely. Holy cow, it's so beautiful. But the problem is, it's so topographically constrained. The physical carrying capacity of this place is forcing everybody to walk right here or walk over on the other less pretty, less close to the Babbling Brook path that connects all of the campsites together. So the National Park Service doesn't have a whole lot of options here. And so, where the use is very intensive, we're going to fall back to our management rule. Where the use is very intensive, the management therefore must also be very intensive. And Phantom Ranch is possibly one of the most intensively managed spots that I can think of anywhere in the backcountry for the entire United States National Park System, right? 100 million acres, hundreds of millions of visits per year. This place receives a lot of work because we're just on the hook. We just don't have a lot of other options right here. If we close down this trail, somebody's gonna reopen it. Somebody's just gonna walk through there anyway. It's a beautiful spot. Why wouldn't they? They'd be crazy not to. Unfortunately, we can't make that sustainable. So we're constantly gonna be repairing this spot forever. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. Maybe there are other options we'll talk about. All right. So, our ideal soils for trails, and Grand Canyon does not typically have an ideal mix of soils for trails. It's going to be pretty, sandy, because most of the walls of the Grand Canyon are, sandstone, parent material relationship or dependence. Again, that even mix of particle sizes. We want lots and lots of coarse fragments where it's steep. All right, so if you know what a talus slope is, or a scree field, where I have miles and miles sometimes, literally, of just coarse fragments piled on the surface of the earth where erosion has left them. Anything smaller than that is just going to get carried down the slope. So any trails in alpine areas, so above tree line or above that alpine transition zone, we're going to be walking across scree fields. And a scree field is basically the flattish version of a talus slope. A talus slope is basically the coarse fragment version of the slanted side of a sand dune, right? It's just the particles are much bigger. And if you think about waves being able to move sand very easily, right, we're getting the equivalent of wave energy on top of a mountain. So anything that's smaller than fairly large coarse fragments, and the higher elevation you go, the bigger those fragments have to be, to the point that you can be hopping or leaping from stone to stone, from coarse fragment to get from point A to point B. Super fun, great way to break an ankle, or Aaron Ralston your way to ignominy. Ask me later if you don't know who Aaron Ralston is. And we do want up to a few percent of that organic content. Much more than a few percent. And we're getting into essentially sort of engineered swamp conditions. So we did some studies at Acadia National Park for what kind of soil do we want to use in this highly erosive, thin, granitic soil environment that's literally butted right up against the Atlantic Ocean and has to deal with all those storm energies, all that wave action, all of the millions of visitors a year, 4.5 million visitors a year these days. And what we found was when we take the organic content up beyond a couple of percent and surface the entire trail in wood chips, it's a disaster. You hate to see it. Very low energy. All of that organic material just holds water. And then you've got water, and it's wetter on the trail than everywhere else around it. And the soil underneath those wet wood chips is saturated and wet for much, much longer. It's weaker. It's got that lowered soil strength, so it's subsiding. It's getting muddy. It's a disaster, right? So more than a few percent of organic material is typically beyond what we are looking for that humic molecule adhesion, that sticky glue consistency. Okay? Cool. All right. Let's talk about 4 soil transformation processes and contextualize them specifically to forest and outdoor recreation management. First, soil transformation. Changing the character, the attributes of the soil. Its chemical profile, right? pH. Soil with a bunch of organic material, probably fairly acidic. Those humic molecules form humic acids. Dissolve things like limestone. We can also translocate soil, move it from one place to another. We've already talked about how Peoria loess is soil that was translocated from the surface of Missouri's glacially sculpted flatlands north of the Ozarks. and dumped unceremoniously here so we could grow enormous big muddy monsters on Illinois soy and corn. And then additions and losses to the soil profile, the column of soil down to the bedrock and up to the surface. Those are going to be our erosion and deposition processes. Okay, so erosion is going to be a soil loss, but that soil always goes somewhere. We don't transform it directly into energy through nuclear fusion or fission. We move that soil someplace. So, for example, in recreation management, when we're talking about trail erosion specifically, we want to have a real hard come to Jesus moment think about what is everything downslope of where I want to put any part of this trail. Because some of that soil from this trail is going to erode despite our best efforts. Every trail loses a little bit of its soil as dirt, and it's going to go down slope, right? Physics. There is a process called saltation where wind can actually push soils up slopes briefly, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a sec if you'd like. But for the most part, we're pretty much overwhelmingly concerned with how is this trail, as it is evolving morphologically, as it is subsiding maybe a little bit, if we haven't mechanically compacted it down to the point where it physically can't subside because there's no pore space below it, this can radically alter or even destroy whole ass ecosystems, guys. In places like Yosemite, places like Tuolumne Meadows, which is a beautiful, beautiful high elevation meadow system, kind of towards the top of the slopes of the Sierras, like the mountain ranges that kind of defines Yosemite National Park. And Tuolumne Meadow is one end of the Pacific Crest Trail as it goes through, starts with the border with Mexico, a couple hundred miles through the desert, and then hike up the spine of the Sierras, and you get all the way up to Yosemite, which is, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of the way up north towards Canada, the northern terminus of the trail. Tuolumne Meadows is like, you got Yosemite Forest down here, Tuolumne Meadows, and then you've got the rest of the trail going up into the Alpine Zone along the section of the Pacific Crest Trail called the John Muir Trail, which is like some of the most scenic hiking anywhere in the world. So it's very high demand. And Tuolumne Meadows are fairly high slope. The grassy meadows, they're full of wildflowers, so things like butterflies love Tuolumne. People like influencers love Tuolumne because they love to throw their bodies back on these beautiful wildflower blooms, kill them all, but they get that sick influencer picture with the butterflies before the butterflies all die. Anyway, side note. What happens with visitor-created trails going sideways along the top edge of Tuolumne Meadows is exactly this. Walk that trail in where there was no trail before, where the water from everything above watershed of that point could flow past that point, watering the meadow. You hike a trail in there, and that trail hydrologically functions like an irrigation ditch. It entrains, it captures that water at the top of the meadow, and then makes it flow sideways along the trail because the trail has subsided, like a little ditch, like a little stream bed, like we just saw at the bottom of a watershed down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon at Phantom Ranch. And so what rec ecologists found at Tuolumne Meadows was it only takes a couple of years of this process for visitor-created trails to completely renovate the species composition at a big, beautiful, and critically important to a bunch of wildlife species spots like Tuolumne. So, these additions and losses in the form of, translocation, subsidence would be a translocation, right? So we're moving it down, not by transport, but just by compaction. And the additions and losses are causing the formation of irrigation ditches, which totally destroy the overland hydrologic regime for these areas. Super bad. Super bad. Let's see if I got a picture of that. I thought I did. Not so much. All right, let's move on. Let's see if I can find something for you guys. A couple of special soils that we gotta pay extra attention to. So, for example, sandy soils have, in specific areas, stuff called cryptobiotic crust, which looks like this photo here. And each of these flakes of this crust is an entire biologic community of bacteria, fungi, algae, cyanobacteria. It's all sort of growing in this real thin paste. Like we mentioned briefly earlier in the semester, this stuff can take like a century to grow a centimeter thick. But it's just very crusty sand. Right, so if you've ever gotten sand in your boots and you pull your socks off, pull your boots off, after hiking through sand one day and you got a bunch of toe cheese and the sand is mixed with the toe cheese and everything's kind of sticking to everything else, that's kind of what this stuff is, and then baked by the sun over the course of a century. And a single footstep punches right through this, breaks that apart, releases the sand from this sort of very, very, very slightly sticky biological matrix. This stuff is maybe a couple of millimeters thick. It's not particularly heavy. It's just sort of resting on top of the sand. It doesn't look like anything. And so people walk right through it all the time. Here's what that looks like in practice. So this is at Canyonlands National Park. So this was a photo from summer camp a while back, right? So this entire trail is a sacrifice zone that has been walked down to bedrock through a couple of millimeters of sand and a couple of millimeters of cryptobiotic crust. This trail would take thousands of years to regenerate to look like this. Thousands of years, right? This is in no way sustainable. So this is absolutely a conscious decision on the United States National Park Service's behalf of saying, okay, we are going to have people recreating in Canyonlands National Park. That's half of our mission. The other half of our mission is to protect this and everything. The entire ecosystem depends on this cryptobiotic crust. This stuff is what's holding all this sand in place. So any kind of windstorm blows through here and blows over the crypto crust and doesn't take that 2 millimeters, 5 millimeters of sand, right? This much soil that's taken tens of thousands of years to generate, and leaves it there and provides root capacity for literally everything else, right? As the cryptobiotic crust goes, so does everything else. Everything else dies out when the crypto crust is gone. So we're going to use a sacrifice zone. We're going to run trails straight through this stuff. And we're going to educate folks. Or we're going to run the majority of our trails far away from our fields or patches of crypto crust. But where we have to take it through those spots to connect things up or whatever, we are going to do the hard math and understand we are killing and biologically separating this community microbiologically and entomologically. This is a separate, distinct community now from this one. So from the background of the image to the foreground are two separate systems. Archaeology researchers at Yosemite National Park found that certain species of ants cannot cross trails that are more than about 6-8 inches wide because predators, birds, amphibians that like to eat those ants because they're nutrient rich, and they're like eating little sour burst gushers. Has anybody ever eaten ants before? All right, so ants, when they bite, they inject formic acid. It's a very simple organic acid. It's the simplest one. It's a methylated carboxylic acid group. So acids taste sour, right? Citric acid, in citrus fruits and stuff like that. So, like crisped up ants, high protein, they're delicious. A little sour, little protein bites. Anyway, certain ants, they can't cross a trail. So when we put in a trail, we are making a decision to literally fragment this habitat. So for those of you in environmental studies or coming from the geography program, this is what habitat fragmentation looks like. In this case, it's done on purpose in a very tightly controlled situation because we gotta put thousands of visitors through this desert environment. So we're gonna educate them very clearly and specifically, and we're gonna have a pretty big stick to beat people with fines-wise if anybody is caught walking across this stuff. And all of this is made very clear at the visitor center. Brandon.
How'd you get this photo? Did you have to step in it?
No, if you look, there are exposed bedrocks all over the place. So yeah, like I'm not gonna lead a class out there and be like, hey guys, let's talk about crypto. Oh shit. No, like this stuff is like very easy to spot the moment you start training your eye to look for it. And so you just hopscotch from one thing to the next, and it's biologically in there to step over it. Doesn't matter. That's a great question. Yeah, we definitely gotta practice what we preach on this for sure. We don't want any of these footprints named after SIU forestry yet. So yeah, this is a sacrifice zone. This is absolutely intended to kill off everything where footfalls are going to happen to provide people a meaningful way through this area. And again, that sacrifice zone is going to be a fraction of a percent of the total landmass of this entire area. Okay, so the math works out okay. Yeah, this is basically a permanent modification of this spot, ecologically at least. I don't know how many thousands of human lifetimes it would be before this grew back. And you can't, at least I'm not aware that you can just like, yeah, sprinkle some crack on them and let's get out of here. You know, like fertilize cryptobiotic crust. It just doesn't work like that. So we can do like restoration ecology with it, but we could at least fence people out for a while. Yeah, anyway, moving on. Here's what it looks like up close. You can see that this stuff is just like a discoloration on top of sand. Like this is a fraction of a millimeter thick in this photo. All right, and desert varnish is gonna be a non-biological counterpart of the same thing. So this is newspaper rock on the drive-in in that same area in Utah. And it is some few extremely old, legit, or authentic or genuine petroglyphs. And then a whole bunch of asshats carving on top of those. You can tell by the way it is. No, you can tell by the freshness, right? So desert varnish is a naturally forming oxide reaction that basically is weeping out of the sandstone rock as an impurity, and then it undergoes a chemical reaction and sort of bakes on as a varnish onto the surface of these rocks and turns the red sandstone, kind of that burnt umber, almost blackish color in some light. So this is a function of a soil generation process, right? This is happening on top of the bedrock. And so this is a weird way to think about soils, but for this class, I'm going to argue that we're going to classify this as a soil resource as well as a human cultural one, or human archaeological one, excuse me. Okay? So, let's make sure the sound is off here. What we get when we have conflict, this is a video of me about 15 years ago at Yosemite National Park, trying to help illustrate what problems with recreation can look like relative to things like varnishes. I'll spare the monologuing here. This is a boulder right at the side of the trail. This is where rock climbers have taken bleach and wire brushes and used power tools to essentially rasp and chemically bleach off the natural surface of the rock, cleaning the root to provide slightly less organically greasy handhold, so to speak, on this granite for climbing. This is a permanent damage. So we're now into what are the dynamics of impact of these resources from a recreation perspective. And it's unfortunate, but this is going to be a thing forever. Some jackwagon just really wanted to send it, bruh. Now this was done before people use words like bruh and send it, but we all get to look at that eyesore forever now. And the park leaves this very much in sight as a teachable moment of, hey, look, we can do this right, or we can do this as visitors. Okay? So, we were talking about sand dunes earlier. Let's talk a little bit about beach dune incision. So here's an example of that. So the surface of the dune drops down where people have walked through and goes back up out of frame on the other side. It is a single storm event following this incision, following the cutting of this vegetation by boots, usually, by stepping on them. A single storm event is enough to wipe out the dune and sort of scoop out all the sand that's being held under. It just goes underneath the root hairs and pulls everything out. I'm like, what are you going to do? Fight the ocean, right? So prevention is 100% of the game here. So this is one of those spots where our fourth strategy, limiting use, pretty much is going to be the go-to on grass-rooted dunes. Okay, so sand dunes that are not covered in grass and anchored by those grassy root hairs are going to be called marching dunes. And marching dunes are the ones that are continuously sculpted by wind. We're a lot less worried about erosion impacts, high torque, high horsepower stuff, scraping through those. Where we have dunes that are capped in grasses, so shore grasses and so forth, we're going to have to rely on snow fencing or hurricane fencing, or beach fencing. It's that kind of fencing you see with a whole bunch of, it's like a couple of strands of twisted wire, so double helix twisted wire, and then slats paired down through each of the twists in the wire at the top and the wire at the bottom. And the whole idea with snow fencing or hurricane or beach or dune fencing is to serve as a wind break. So when wind hits that fence, it's going to slow down, it's going to angle up, and it's going to drop any sand. So we can try and encourage any dune building and also physically block people from getting on those fences. Dune fences are not fun to climb on or climb over. So this is what that looks like, straight up. This, I believe, was a picture from either St. Joe's Wildlife Refuge in Florida or possibly when we went back to Cumberland Island National Seashore. So on the shore of the Gulf of Mexico or shore of these southern states Atlantic, so southern Georgia, Barrier Island. I mean, there's no soil structure to these soils. It's just piles of sand held in place by just a tiny peach fuzz of grass, right? You can see how incredibly fragile that looks. So we'll talk about cryo resources when we get to water, but we do want to think about one combination of high elevation and or high latitude and or high topographic relief, meaning it's a steep area, and where we have active contribution of snow from our cryo water layer or system, and then an active contribution of, so a high mechanical weather, freeze thaw, freeze thaw rock getting sort of blasted or snapped off of or foliated off of the parent bedrock. You can have soils build up on top of very, very thin and fragile soils. I mean, just tissue thin, comparatively speaking, soils on top of the ice, right? And in some places, this is a very particular, peculiar kind of ecosystem. So tundra, taiga, places like that. This is a soil type or soil phenomenon in places like Denali National Park. So if anybody has a high latitude park like Glacier or Denali or Gates of the Arctic or any of those, you need to think about perched soils. And perched soils are mostly not very biologically active, right? It's so cold and it's so actively weathered here that we're not building up like high quality farming soils here, right? There's not a lot of moles digging through this and living their best life, for example. What we do see are a whole lot of the human wildlife species thinking, oh man, this is so cool. I bet if we hiked up here, we could sit on our butts and, slide down to probably here. Oh, that'd be a sick GoPro video for my Facebook page. And the problem is, to get up there, you gotta go over these perched soils at least somewhere to get there. And these perched soils are on rotten snow and rotten ice. And so when you're walking on this stuff, you have no idea what you're stepping on, right? There could be a fissure, a crevasse, there could be anything underfoot, just covered over by a thin dusting of coarse fragments or smaller particles, mostly coarse fragments. And so where we have perched soils, the search and rescue gets hard because, man, if somebody is walking through this stuff with an 80-pound pack doing Arctic backcountry travel, and they step through and they punch through, and they punch through up to their knee, and then hyperextend their knee like another 35, 45 degrees, and then that 80-pound pack pushes them down, right? That's pretty bad. Or if they go a little bit higher and they snap their femur, and the weight pushes that femur out the front of the back of the leg, we got a compound fracture. But now we've got to get a bunch of rescue rangers out there to get that person out, because you can't self-rescue with a compound femur fracture, right? So it's like life would be so good if you could just, for this stuff, buy the postcard in the visitor center, all right? Use your mind's eye. Like, stay off of this stuff. It's super potentially dangerous. And with that, let's call it for today. I'm around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'm going to go home and faceplant in bed and try and get better. Hang on to this Hazard Tree Lab and take a look through it for our next couple of classes. And before the weather gets real cold here, I'll turn you loose on campus so we can do some field work. All right, I'm around for questions.